Good morning and welcome back to the kelogsloops YouTube channel. So today's video is going to be the start of a series of watercolor tutorial videos that I'll be making. Partly because a lot of you guys have been asking about when I was going to start making these watercolor tutorials and advice videos. So it's about time I just gave it a crack. Without further ado, the introduction to watercolor. So to start off, what we're going to need is some supplies. First, you'll need some sort of paper. It could be a sketchbook or specifically watercolor paper. I'll be using 300 GSM cold press watercolor paper for this tutorial. Now you'll need some paint. You can use disc cakes, watercolor tubes, or even watercolor pans. It's up to you. For this video, I'll be using Winsor & Newton's Cotman watercolor pans. Watercolor is a water-based medium, so these dried pans or cakes need a bit of water applied to activate the paint. It's recommended to lightly wet the pans before use, or even misting them lightly with the spray bottle. Next, you'll need some brushes. Different brushes have different effects and purposes, so I'll go through these in another video, as they're specific brush heads suitable for watercolor. For now, any brush will do. Next, grab some paper towel or tissue paper, or even a spare piece of paper, that will do. This will be used to dry off your wet brushes and wipe away excess water, and even sampling colours before you apply them to your work. Lastly, you'll need to grab a cup or jar of some sort. Make that two, and fill them with water. One will be for dirty water and paint, and the other will be for clean water. Try get into this habit as early as possible, otherwise you'll end up like me who constantly mixes them up. The purpose of having clean water is so that when you go to apply watercolor, the color will come out a lot clearer, brighter and stronger, as opposed to using dirty water, which often makes colors murky and muddy. Now let's start off with some basics. For now we'll talk about only two different types of watercolor brush techniques that you can use. There's wet on wet and wet on dry. These are two techniques that you can use to paint for starters, and eventually you can start to mix them up even and use them both to create awesome effects once you understand how they work and their advantages. First, let's look at wet on wet techniques. The technique is when you apply wet paint onto a wet surface. So for this first example, what we're going to do is wet the surface of the paper generously. With the water still wet and beady, let's apply a generous amount of paint. And that's the effect you get. The paint slowly disperses into the area and shape which you painted with water, and eventually it dries up to stain the paper and create a soft effect. While the paint is still wet, you actually can continue to work the paint a bit more into the paper, so you can do bleeds and even gradient effects. Next, we're going to use a more subtle effect of wet on wet techniques. First, apply some water and spread it onto the surface with a brush so that the paper soaks it in a bit. Apply a bit of paint and voila! It's a fanning effect. The paint spreads out to wherever the paper has been wet, so it creates this interesting effect. But the best thing about it is that it's easy to blend colours. Because while the paper and paint is still wet, you can easily work the paint to blend and create gradients. The next technique we look at is wet on dry. It's where we apply wet paint onto dry surfaces. The advantage here is that you can use the paint to create bold, strong colours in defining shape and forms. Basically, it's great for outlining and creating detail. Lastly, we're going to be using a combination of both techniques. So the more you get used to watercolour and experimenting with it, you start being able to mix and use both techniques. Here, I'm using wet on wet first to create the soft bleeding effect, and then wet on dry to create the fine details. You can even apply wet on dry first, and then rework the paint while it's still wet with clean water, so that the effect eventually becomes more wet on wet technique. This way you get the best of both worlds, of sharp details and subtle blending. I'll go through these techniques in more detail in a future video, but for now let's use the knowledge and apply it in creating a portrait. First, with watercolour, the rule is that you paint light to dark, especially if you plan on painting in layers like I do. Here, for the hair, I want to use both techniques so I can create crisp details on the hair strands and some nice blends in the mass of hair for variation, like so. I also wanted to add a bit of colour to the skin in the form of a blended blush, so I'll wet the surface first and then apply a wet on wet technique to create a nice gradient. If the paint has gone too far, but it's still wet, don't worry, you can still fix it. All you need to do is use some paper or tissue and soak it up, and erase the paint while it's still activated. To add lips, I'm going to use a wet on dry technique to create the sharp detail in the outline of the lips, like so. For her clothing, I wanted to create a similar mix of techniques like I did with the hair, but this time I wanted to apply a blend of colours. So first I wet the surface of the paper and add the pink like so. While it's still wet, I begin to add the blue, creating sharp details and outlines of the top. Next, I start to blend the colours like so. And voila, a gradient while using both techniques. The pink did fade a little bit, so while the paint was still wet, I added more colours to saturate it and add some pop to the pink. Once the first layer dries though, you can go over it with wet on dry techniques to create fine details and emphasize form. I can use it to create strands of hair or even add little flecks like this. Watercolour is a very experimental and intuitive medium, so the best way to learn is to explore and experiment as much as you can. Try out different colour combinations, try mixing up your own techniques, and eventually you'll develop a sense of what works best for you. Remember, watercolour is a water-based medium, so it's not just how you apply a paint, it's also how you use the water to apply it. You can create different effects by applying different amounts of water. Experiment, experiment, and experiment. That's honestly my best advice. Feel free to leave a comment down below, guys, of any suggestions for videos or topics you want me to cover, and I'll try my best to do all of them. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you soon.